It's a really interesting thing to live in an environment where you're isolated from your own language in the broader social sense. When I first came here, I didn't know very much Czech at all. Just, the basic stuff to, count money or order in a restaurant, take a taxi, which meant that it was impossible for me to eavesdrop. And so the murmur of conversation around me was just that, a murmur, a background noise. I was never distracted by what anyone else had to say, and as a result, I was living in an island where my language was really my own idiom, and I existed entirely within that. And being removed from a certain amount of social pressure and influence allowed me to inhabit that idiom fully, and that very much influenced my writing in terms of developing a voice, a written voice, and a sensibility that turned out to be pretty distinct and original and led to my writing, or allowed my writing to turn into something that stood out a little bit. My first book was written here. It's a book-length poem called Because, and I don't know that I could have written this book anywhere else. Not just because of the linguistic separation, but also because when you live in a place where the literary community is by and large in another language, you're taking influence through translation. You're being exposed to other modes of expression and understanding and ways of looking at the literary world, and you're removed from the trends and fashions that are predominant in your own language. And I was able to step into other ways of thinking about literature that we might not have been exposed to. And part of that was through my own translation work, and of course being exposed to Czech writers in translation. When I first came here, I was actually not in Prague. I was living in Brno, which is a city about 2 hours south of Prague. But I would come to Prague on the weekends, and one time I did have a chance to spend a few weeks here in one go. And it was a really revelatory experience for me. First, for the sheer beauty of the city itself and its architecture, the incredible wealth of its literary history and intellectual history, but also just the environment, which is so conducive to creativity. A friend of mine, Paula Trumbo, once talked about the dynamic environment. And you can find this in nature, in the mountains or by the sea, any place where the landscape is constantly shifting and changing and exposing new possibilities for seeing what's around you. And I would say Prague very much as a city is a dynamic environment. I've been here for 15 years, and as a person who gets bored very easily, I would have thought that after 5, 10, or 15 years, I would have become incredibly bored in such a small city. I mean, it only has about 1.5 million people. But because of its strange fluidity and the way it's constantly transforming, that sort of perpetual metamorphosis of the city, and I don't mean just the changing of businesses or the kinds of things that you see in any city through gentrification or just the normal processes of change, but the way the light itself can deconstruct the architecture. Sitting on a single balcony on a single day, the light changing will make it look like, or make it seem like you're staring at 10 different cities or 10 different landscapes. So that incredible dynamism is really important. I moved to Prague in 2003 when I finished school. I was in part a debt refugee. I had student loans and credit cards that I just didn't even know how to be responsible for. I didn't want to continue going to graduate school. I didn't want to do a PhD. I didn't want to see another classroom again. So I moved to Prague because I had friends here. I had lived here before, and it seemed like a good place to be a writer, insofar as it was inexpensive. I could afford to be here on an incredible amount of debt and a credit card that I burned up fairly quickly. And when that was gone, then I did find myself in a classroom in the sense that I was teaching English as a second language for a few years. And by pure accident, I ended up getting a full-time job in a regular company, 9-to-5 style, which has actually worked really well for me as a writer. I don't do well with incredible amounts of free time. I write better in resistance to other structures, in the pockets. And the thing about working in a company is a lot of time gets wasted. Like you're waiting for meetings, you're waiting for calls, you're in meetings which last forever and they're incredibly boring. And one of my early jobs was taking the minutes. And what I realized is people just repeat themselves over and over again. So my minutes would start to turn into poems. I would just build poems into the minutes of the meeting and then extract them afterwards. And it's worked really well for me living here. I think that there's a lot less pressure commercially in terms of having to have the latest things and have a lot of money, and there's a little bit less materialism. And of course, working in a place where my healthcare is covered by the state, where I don't have these financial stressors, my mental space isn't occupied as much with survival as it might be if I lived in the United States or Canada. And so this allows my imagination more space to roam and write. There are a number of Czech writers who've had a profound influence on my own writing, contemporary writers who are just absolutely remarkable in terms of their sensibilities, their image, the language they use, the turns of phrase. A few writers I really admire would be Milan Dzerzhinsky. He won the Magnesia Literaria this year for his second book, but his first volume, Secret Life, is a really profound and incredibly moving collection of poems. I think he's a really fantastic poet, and I was, very lucky to be able to read his entire collection in a wonderful translation by Nathan Fields, who's really one of the best translators in this country, I think. Justin Quinn is also a really fantastic translator and a very good friend of mine, and he's been a great translator of many Czech poets. Among the contemporary poets, Petr Borkovec stands out to me as a poet who's really incredible, especially in terms of the way he explores nature and the natural world and his relationship to that. I really like Petr Hruška's poems, especially in Jonathan Bolton's translations. A magazine that I co-edit with some friends called Body recently published a number of Bolton's translations of Hruška, which were really just, I think, quite wonderful. I really like Olga Peck's poetry. This I don't receive in translation because she translates it herself, so in a way it is actually an original product in English. She's one of these rare writers who just slips so seamlessly between languages. She's really incredible. She's actually the editor of Sivino, which is probably one of the best Czech poetry publications, and is a place where actually I discovered a lot of great writing, like Maria Šťastná, who I've translated, is a really great poet I discovered in her magazine, in Sivino. It's really hard. It's such a huge list, and it includes writers who've been dead for 100 years and people who are, in their early 20s, just starting out now, but they're already doing such a